His triumphant smile vanished. The moment the woman in the red dress descended the marble stairs, he discarded a devoted wife, completely unaware that she held the deeds to his existence. Why does betrayal always blind a man to his own impending ruin? Julian adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of their high-rise Chicago condo, his reflection a monument to his own arrogance. He ran a hand over his perfectly styled hair, his chest puffed out as if he were already standing on the podium. Tonight was the firm's 50th anniversary gala, the night he fully expected to be named senior partner. He was 35, impeccably groomed, and in his own mind, the absolute center of the architectural world. He didn't even bother to turn around when Clara walked into the room. She stood quietly a few feet behind him, wrapped in an oversized, heavy, knit sweater that swallowed her frame. Her hair was tied back in a simple, loose knot. To Julian, she was nothing more than a piece of outdated furniture, a remnant of the days when he was just a struggling student and she was the one paying the rent. He had outgrown her, just as a soaring skyscraper outgrows the messy dirt of its excavation site. "Are you really going to wear that all night?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. His eyes met hers in the mirror, cold and dismissive. "It's a good thing this is a closed-door event for the top brass. You'd drag down the entire aesthetic of the room looking like that. You look like a woman who gave up a decade ago." Clara did not flinch. She didn't offer a tear, a defense, or a sudden outburst of anger. She simply stood perfectly still, her hands tucked inside the long sleeves of her sweater. For years, she had deliberately maintained this quiet, unassuming facade, pouring her own vast, hidden wealth into a blind trust that funded his projects, just to protect his fragile male ego. She had built the very ground he walked on, and now he was using it to wipe his feet. "Have a good time tonight, Julian," Clara said, her voice entirely flat, entirely devoid of the warmth she used to offer him. "I will," he scoffed, grabbing his platinum watch from the dresser. "I'm about to secure my legacy. Don't wait up." He walked past her, without so much as a brush of his shoulder, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. In the stifling silence of the apartment, Clara finally let out a slow, measured breath. He had just laid the final brick of his own tomb. She already knew about the late-night texts. She already knew about the extravagant withdrawals from the joint accounts she secretly kept afloat. She had endured his insults tonight for one final reason: to see if there was even a single fracture of decency left in the man she once loved. There wasn't. The structural integrity of their marriage was completely gone, and it was time for control for demolition. Down in the lavish, marble-floored lobby of the building, Julian's condescending sneer transformed into a charismatic, predatory smile. Waiting for him near the revolving doors was Chloe. She was 25, draped in a backless, striking teal designer dress that clung to her every curve. She practically vibrated with eager materialistic energy as Julian approached. "You look like a king," Chloe purred, stepping into his arms. "And a king needs to reward his queen," Julian replied smoothly. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a long velvet box. Chloe gasped as he flipped it open. Resting on the dark fabric was a breathtaking, custom-designed diamond necklace. Julian stepped behind her, brushing her hair aside to clasp the cold, heavy stones around her neck. He felt a rush of absolute invincibility. He didn't care that the money for the diamonds and the keys to the luxury sports car he was about to drop into her purse came from the joint savings account he shared with his wife. In his supreme arrogance, he assumed Clara was far too simple and financially illiterate to ever notice the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was the breadwinner, the genius, the architect of his own destiny. He believed he could just shift the numbers around tomorrow after his promotion. He stood entirely above the law. "Oh, Julian, it's perfect," Chloe squealed, admiring her reflection in the lobby's glass doors. "Are we taking a cab to the gala?" "Not tonight," Julian smirked, dropping a heavy leather-bound key fob into her waiting palm. "Your new ride is waiting with the valet." Chloe let out a shriek of delight, throwing her arms around his neck. Julian wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, leading her out into the crisp night air, utterly blind to the catastrophic flaw in his grand design. High above the bustling city streets, Clara stood in the darkness of the penthouse, looking out through the massive pane of glass. Far below, the sleek new luxury car pulled away from the curb, its engine roaring into the night, carrying with it the echoing, high-pitched laughter of her husband's mistress. Clara watched the red taillights disappear into the Chicago traffic. Slowly she raised her chin. In the dark reflection of the window, the image of the frumpy, long-suffering housewife faded away. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and terrifyingly calm, and as the distant sound of the engine faded, a cold, ruthless half-smile finally curved across her lips. The cold half-smile faded from Clara's face, replaced instantly by the rigid, calculating efficiency of a woman going to work. She turned away from the massive pane of glass, leaving the glittering skyline of the city behind her. The heavy, oversized knit sweater she wore suddenly felt suffocating. She pulled it over her head and tossed it onto the pristine white sofa, discarding the docile, clueless housewife Julian thought he had left behind just moments ago. She walked down the silent hallway into her darkened home office, illuminated only by the steady, pulsing, standby light of her dual monitors. Clara sat down in the leather chair, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced, ruthless speed. She didn't open the standard joint checking account, the petty cash pool Julian always assumed she spent her days fretting over. Instead, she bypassed the domestic facade entirely. She entered a complex sequence of security credentials, accessing the encrypted, high-level financial portal of the parent conglomerate that wholly owned the architectural firm employing her husband. The screens flared to life, bathing her sharp features in a pale blue glow. Clara pulled up the master ledger for the firm's primary commercial development fund. She had suspected for weeks that Julian was siphoning money to fund his double life, but seeing the raw data laid out in digital ink was a different kind of revelation. Her eyes darted across the spreadsheets, dissecting the numbers with the brilliant, analytical mind that had silently doubled her family's wealth over the past decade. Julian hadn't just skimmed a bonus or padded an expense report. In a staggering display of arrogance, he had taken a sledgehammer to the load-bearing pillars of the firm's quarterly budget. Over $200,000 had been meticulously laundered through bogus vendor invoices and disguised as luxury material costs. He had committed textbook corporate embezzlement. All to buy a high-end sports car and a diamond necklace for a 25-year-old woman he wanted to impress. Any microscopic trace pity she might have harbored for the struggling student she had married a decade ago evaporated instantly. Julian wasn't a flawed man making a mistake. He was a parasite actively eroding the foundation of her empire. He actually believed his own grandiose narrative that he was a self-made financial and architectural genius, utterly untouchable, operating far above the rules that governed ordinary people. He had no idea that he had just stolen from the one entity with the power to strip him of his license forever. He didn't know that the ground beneath his feet was entirely owned by the woman, whose appearance he had just openly mocked. Clara did not cry. There was no grief left in her chest, only the cold, hard steel of impending justice. Without taking her eyes off the damning numbers on the screen, she reached for her cell phone and pressed a single speed dial button. The secure line rang only once before a deep, resonant voice answered. "Clara," Arthur said. His tone was steady, carrying the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who had navigated ruthless boardrooms for 40 years. "I take it the evening's events have commenced." He took the money. "Uncle Arthur," Clara said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute command. Not just from the blind trust. He accessed the commercial development escrow. Embezzlement, plain and simple. A heavy, knowing silence stretched over the line. Arthur had spent years acting as the formidable figurehead for the corporation, shielding his niece so she could attempt to have a normal life, a normal marriage, without the corrupting influence of the family's immense wealth. He had always warned her that a man lacking his own structural integrity would eventually try to steal hers. The extent of the damage? Arthur asked softly. "Fatal," Clara replied without hesitation. "To his career, at least. He thinks he's walking into the anniversary gala tonight to be named a senior partner. He thinks he outsmarted the accounting department. He forgot who built the department," Arthur noted, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Are you finally ready to stop playing the supportive wife in the shadows, my dear?" "The wife is dead," Clara stated, closing the laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. "I am the chairman now." She stood up, her mind already shifting to the logistics of the evening. The blueprint for Julian's destruction was fully drafted. All that remained was the execution. Clara lifted the phone closer, her voice dropping to a tone of pure, freezing ice as she issued her final commands. Uncle Arthur, I want his corporate access revoked. Freeze all joint assets immediately, and tell the security team to prepare the ballroom. We are doing a massive cleanup tonight. The silent, devastating order for a massive cleanup had already been issued in the shadows of the city, but inside the grand ballroom of the Chicago Hotel, the primary target of that operation was floating on a cloud of absolute delusion. Julian stood near the center of the cavernous room, holding a slender flute of vintage champagne. The crystal glass caught the brilliant light of the vaulted chandeliers, sparkling almost as brightly as the stolen diamonds, resting against the collarbone of the young woman and clinging to his arm. He guided Chloe through the sea of bespoke tuxedos and silk evening gowns, not merely walking, but surveying the crowd like a master architect, admiring a skyline he had personally designed. Every head turned as they passed, and the low murmur of whispers followed them like a physical wave. They cannot stop staring at you, Chloe whispered, leaning in close so the scent of her heavy, expensive perfume washed over him. Her eyes darted around the room, drinking in the envious glances of the older wives. I feel like royalty. They aren't just looking at you, Chloe. They are looking at the future, Julian corrected smoothly, taking a slow, savoring sip of his champagne. Tonight, the foundation of this entire firm shifts. These people know exactly who holds up the profit margins around here. They are looking at the next senior partner. A mid-level executive stepped into their path, practically bowing as he's offered an eager handshake. Brilliant quarterly numbers, Julian. Truly phenomenal work. We're all expecting major news from the chairman's address tonight. Julian offered a practiced, magnanimous smile, the kind reserved for those far beneath him. We simply build on what works, Marcus. Success in this industry is just a matter of structural integrity. You either have the vision to construct an empire, or you belong in the concrete mixing crew. As the executive scurried away with a nervous laugh, Julian's chest swelled against the lapels of his custom suit. He felt a profound, intoxicating rush of invincibility. In his mind, he was a titan. He thought, for just a fleeting second, of the apartment he had left behind an hour ago. He pictured Clara asleep on their sofa, buried inside that hideous, oversized wool sweater, completely oblivious to the monumental heights her husband had reached. She had been a useful source of scaffolding in his early years, providing the raw materials and financial support when he was just a nobody struggling to read blueprints. But scaffolding was meant to be torn down and discarded once the masterpiece was finished. He had outgrown her. He had outgrown the mediocre life she represented. The fact that he had used their joint accounts to finance Chloe's necklace and luxury car didn't even register as a crime in his consciousness. To Julian, it was merely an unauthorized bridge loan from his own brilliant future. He was the breadwinner, he was the genius. He was entirely untouchable. Across the expansive room, standing quietly near the elevated mahogany podium, was Arthur Sterling. The silver-haired chairman looked out over the crowded ballroom with an expression of impenetrable, terrifying calm. Julian caught the older man's eye over the rim of his champagne flute. With a confident, arrogant smirk, Julian offered a slight nod and raised his glass in a silent toast to the man he believed was about to hand him the keys to the kingdom. Arthur did not smile. He did not raise a glass in return. He simply blinked, his gaze as cold and assessing as a building inspector. Finding a fatal, irreversible crack in a concrete pillar, Julian chuckled softly to himself, misreading the chairman's asik demeanor entirely. Old money is always so incredibly stiff, he thought, pulling Chloe a little closer to his side. He knows he has to step aside for new blood tonight, and it's killing him. Slowly the low hum of the string quartet faded into Xanthus. A subtle, electric shift in the room's atmosphere drew all attention towards the front stage. Waiters stopped pouring wine. The hushed conversations evaporated. The time had finally come. Julian handed his half-empty champagne glass to a passing waiter, freeing his hands for the applause he was absolutely certain he was about to receive. He turned his head slightly toward Chloe, a predatory, victorious gleam in his eyes. "Watch closely," Julian murmured, his voice thick with unchecked hubris. "This is the exact moment I take everything." A sharp screech of microphone feedback echoed through the cavernous hall, instantly silencing the elite crowd and drawing every eye to the front of the room. At the podium, Chairman Arthur Sterling adjusted the silver stand, his cold gaze locked directly onto the center of the ballroom floor. Julian's heart pounded with a victorious, adrenaline-fueled rhythm. He casually adjusted the knot of his expensive silk tie, squared his tailored shoulders, and took a confident step forward into the clearing. Entirely blind to the steel jaws of the trap that had just snapped shut around him, Julian's polished leather shoes glided across the marble floor as he moved closer to the stage, pulling Chloe along with him. He positioned himself perfectly, in the center of the crowd's line of sight, flanked by the very executives he planned to outrank by the end of the night. He wanted every rival and every board member to have a clear, unobstructed view when Chairman Arthur Sterling inevitably called him up to the podium. "They're all waiting for it," Chloe whispered, her fingers digging into his bicep. She adjusted the stolen diamond necklace at her throat, practically vibrating with the anticipation of stepping into the spotlight as the partner of the firm's new leading man. From his elevated position at the top of the grand staircase, Arthur tapped the microphone. The sharp, whining feedback cut through the low hum of the ballroom, bringing the entire anniversary gala to a dead, expectant silence. Glasses were lowered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed over the speakers, resonant and heavy with an authority that commanded absolute obedience. "For 50 years, this firm has been built on foundations of integrity, vision, and unyielding strength. We have weathered economic storms, outmaneuvered our competitors, and redesigned the skyline of this great city." Julian stood tall, puffing out his chest. He flashed a knowing, triumphant smirk at Chloe. Here it comes, he thought, his heart pounding a victorious, arrogant rhythm against his ribs. The blueprint of his life was finally complete. But tonight, Arthur continued, his eyes sweeping over the quiet crowd and briefly, chillingly, locking onto Julian. "We are not just celebrating our past. We are here to honor the true architect of our continued success. We are here to introduce the majority shareholder, the quiet force who has held the load-bearing walls of this empire together from the shadows." Julian took a half step forward, his hand reflexively reaching up to straighten his silk tie. He was ready to ascend. "It is my absolute honor to finally introduce to you Miss Clara Sterling." Julian froze. His brain short-circuited, refusing to process the audio. "Sterling, Clara?" The name hung in the chilled air, foreign and entirely impossible. He tried to compute the words, his mind frantically scrambling to reject the reality crashing down on his shoulders. The heavy oak doors on the landing behind the podium swung open. The collective gasp from the hundreds of elite guests was audible, a sharp intake of breath that sucked the remaining oxygen straight out of Julian's lungs. Emerging into the brilliant light of the vaulted crystal chandeliers was not the frumpy, invisible woman he had left in their apartment an hour ago. It was a vision of absolute, untouchable power. Clara stepped forward, radiating a cold, sovereign authority. She was draped in a breathtaking, blood-red haute couture gown that flowed around her like liquid fire. The intricate silk moved with predatory grace, and the rare, flawless diamonds dripping from her ears caught the chandelier light, turning her into the undisputed focal point of the room. She looked down at the sea of executives as if they were nothing more than ants in a building she could demolish with a single command. Arthur stepped away from the podium, his stern, intimidating face softening into a look of deep reverence. He extended his hand, offering his arm. Clara took it smoothly, without a trace of hesitation. As Clara and Arthur walked arm in arm down the grand marble staircase, the visual impact struck Julian with the force of a wrecking ball, exactly like the scene captured in the file MDM7.jpg. Julian stood glued to the floor at the base of the stairs, utterly paralyzed. His jaw literally dropped open, his handsome face twisting into a grotesque, ugly mask of horror and disbelief. Beside him, Chloe clutched his arm, her eyes wide and terrified, her teal dress suddenly looking cheap and trivial in the presence of true royalty. "No," Julian's mind screamed, his ego fighting a desperate, losing battle against his own eyes. "It's a trick. It's a mistake. She's just a translator. She's nothing. She doesn't own this." But the reaction of the crowd told the brutal, undeniable truth. The senior partners, the men Julian had spent years kissing up to and trying to emulate, were physically stepping back, bowing their heads in deep respect. as the woman in the red dress descended. They didn't see a helpless housewife. They saw the apex predator of their industry, the foundation of Julian's entire existence, his superiority, his stolen wealth, his supposed genius splintered and collapsed into dust in a matter of seconds. He had stolen from the owner. He had mocked the queen. Clara moved with unhurried precision, the red silk trailing silently behind her on the white marble. She did not raise her voice. She did not show a single ounce of sorrow or heartbreak. She used her sheer, overwhelming presence to crush the last remaining breath of his arrogance. She reached the bottom step and finally stopped. The entire ballroom was dead silent, waiting for the sovereign to make her move. Clara's dark, commanding eyes cut through the crowd and locked entirely onto Julian's bloodless, terrified face. The silence in the grand ballroom stretched so tight, it felt ready to snap. Julian stood paralyzed under the blazing crystal chandeliers, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes locked onto the woman he had dismissed just hours ago. He could not look away from Clara's dark, commanding gaze. The illusion of his entire life was shattering around him in real time, the soundless collapse of a man who suddenly realized he owned absolutely nothing. Her voice, but when she finally spoke, her words echoed through the cavernous space like striking iron. You always told your colleagues that success in this industry was simply a matter of structural integrity, Julian, Clara said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. The red silk of her couture gown swept elegantly across the marble. You love to call yourself a self-made titan. You just conveniently forgot to mention whose money bought the bricks. Julian's lips parted, but no sound came out. His mind scrambled for a lifeline, his panicked gaze darting toward the podium. But Arthur Sterling offered no salvation. The older man simply reached inside his tailored jacket, produced a thick sealed leather folder, and handed it directly to his niece. Clara held the folder out, her expression devoid of any warmth. This is a detailed audit of the Commercial Development Fund. It contains every fraudulent invoice, every hidden transfer, and every dollar you siphon to finance your personal vanity. She dropped the folder onto a silver tray held by a nearby waiter. The heavy thud sounded like gavel falling on stone. Effective immediately, you are terminated from this firm. The board is filing criminal embezzlement charges tomorrow morning, and the State Commission has been notified to permanently revoke your architectural license. The absolute finality of her words broke the spell of Julian's paralysis. The arrogant sneer, the puffed-out chest, the absolute certainty of his own greatness. It all dissolved into pathetic, breathless panic. His knees practically buckled as he lunged forward, stopping only when two massive security guards materialized from the shadows, stepping firmly into his path. Clara, wait, please. Julian's voice cracked, high and desperate. He sounded like a terrified, cornered animal. It's me. We've been married for a decade. I built this place with you. You can't just tear it all down over a mistake. I'll put the money back. I'll leave her. At the mention of her, Chloe violently flinched. The young woman stared at the thick leather folder, then at the towering security guards, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the man she thought was a wealthy king was actually a bankrupt criminal, heading for a prison cell. Leave me, Chloe, shrieked, her voice shrill and entirely stripped of the sweet affection she had faked all evening. She took a massive step back, her hands flying to her neck, as if the heavy diamond necklace suddenly burned her skin. You lied to me. You stole that money. Without another word of defense, Chloe hitched up her expensive teal dress, turned on her heel and bolted toward the side exit, desperate to escape the flashing cameras of the society photographers and the impending reach of the law. Julian watched his mistress abandon him, without a second thought, his jaw trembling. He looked back at Clara, tears of absolute humiliation pooling in his eyes as the elite crowd watched his degradation. Clara, please, he whispered, holding his trembling hands out. Have mercy. Clara did not blink. The woman who had quietly washed his clothes and funded his dreams was gone forever. You built your entire life on a rotten foundation, Julian, she said, her voice a calm, freezing current. And a house of cards cannot withstand a storm. You are nothing but a demolition site. She gave a single brief nod to the guards. The two men grabbed Julian by the lapels of his custom tuxedo. The man who had entered the room believing he was a god was now literally dragged backward across the polished marble floor. He thrashed and shouted, his designer shoes scuffing the pristine stone, his cries of disbelief and despair echoing through the hall. The crowd parted, watching in stunned, glorious silence as Julian was hoisted into the air and hurled out into the cold night. With a resounding, final thud, the massive oak doors were pulled firmly shut, locking his desperate screams outside. The ballroom remained entirely still. The toxic wreckage of Julian Vance had been cleared away. Arthur stepped down from the podium, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. He signaled to a waiter, who immediately stepped forward with a silver tray bearing 2 crystal glasses. Arthur took one and handed the other, a glass of deep, rich red wine, to his niece. Clara took the glass. She looked around the room, meeting the awestruck, deeply respectful gazes of the executives who now knew exactly who held their futures. The suffocating weight of the past decade was gone, replaced by the brilliant, unshakable power of a woman who had finally claimed her rightful throne. She raised her glass of red wine, the crystal, catching the brilliant light of the chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara announced, her voice ringing out clear and full of promise, "let us toast to a new foundation.